Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne insider and Todd Furman.
The Group of Five beat March is on as we have plenty of great content. 2 conferences still to go. We'll knock one out here with the Mountain West. Hopefully you've enjoyed all the Bet the Board college football preview series. The big boys still waiting on the horizon. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague, co-host, and Group of Five analyst extraordinaire, Brad Powers. And Brad, we've done a great job, at least in my opinion, getting through a handful of the leagues already, but we still have 2 leagues left to go, and most importantly, we get to do this without pain breathing down our neck.
I'm energized. I thought I would be, once we got to 4 or 5 of these group of fives, I'd be kind of dreading it, but not the opposite's been true. I'm getting more and more energy because I know that the season's getting closer and closer.
Well, it's probably because we get to save the best for last with the Sun Belt on the horizon next week. We're through the MAC and we're on to the Mountain West today. But before we talk about a league that has gone through a little bit of a facelift, and we'll get into some of the unique changes as far as scheduling is concerned, we've seen a lot of the major media outlets unveil some of their quote-unquote marquee games for national broadcast coming up, and you had some pretty profound tweets. I know clearly, Brad, when it comes to the month of September, if there was one game that you were circling on your calendar to spend quality time in primetime, it's watching Maryland and Charlotte as part of NBC's Big Ten package.
Yeah, that one, because it's not that, and we've already done, obviously, the American with Charlotte, but it'll be a tough first year for, Boise, first-year coach there. That's not going to be a competitive game. The ones that, I'm kind of somewhat excited to see are a lot of these Mountain West teams getting some national spotlight games, whether it's, Wyoming hosting Texas Tech on the opening Saturday night on CBS. The very next day on a Sunday, San Jose State unveils their updated, renovated stadium where they host Oregon State. San Diego State gets UCLA at home on a primetime CBS Saturday night. So at least it's home games for these Group of Five teams getting a look at some new stadiums, and they can show off their program. And maybe one of the 3. I hope it's not Wyoming, but if there's a hint there. But hopefully, one of them can maybe pull off a big upset.
Yeah, it's always interesting when some of these smaller schools get the big stage. I mean, we talked at great lengths about Conference USA playing on the middle of the week, the Mid-American, but those are conference against conference members, not when you get some of the big boys coming into your house and you have the opportunity to be a little bit of a giant killer. We'll get to San Jose State a little bit later, but Brad, I'm not going to lie, I'm really going to miss seeing San Jose State playing in a football stadium where only one half of it was done and the other half looked like a demolition zone. So seeing them playing in an actual football venue now is going to ruin some of that nostalgia I used to get for those late games on FS1 or CBS Sports Network in the twilight of Saturday night, especially early in the year against FCS opponents.
I'm here to tell you it's still going to look different. I watched their spring game. It was broadcasted, it was like Twitter Live. I watched it on Twitter. It's a building. The whole side that they've been working on, it's a building. It's like their football facility. So you're not going to see stands and stuff. I don't know. There was still a lot of dirt. I don't know if they're going to plant flowers or shrubs or something, but it will still be a very unique look with their whole side of the stadium and the side I think that they're going to project the cameras on. You're just going to see a building there. So that's weird.
You know what? It may have a very Division II, Division III feel. I mean, I can't be too critical, having watched a lot of my college football up close and personal in front of the library that overlooked where we played our games at Wesleyan. And let me tell you, on days where it was crappy weather, there was no chance that we were sitting out there in the elements to try and deal with it. So what we used to do back in the day, Brad, is we would get our keg, we would wheel it up the hill, try and take it through the library. And on days where we had crappy weather, we'd make sure we found a trash can can or recycling bin. We found a spot in the library where we could keep it, and we just had to make sure we didn't get too loud and boisterous when we wanted to avoid the elements there. But the things you go through to watch NESCAC football where nobody goes pro or reminds you of the commercials that you see all the time, a lot of these athletes will go pro in something other than athletics. That couldn't have been truer than what we saw out there. But different times, different years. The Mountain West is still at least a little bit better than Division III from top to bottom. And for the first time in a while, the Mountain West will go away from its two-division format. So we're going to get a single division where the two best teams will play for the first time since 2012. When you look at the way this league has gone over the last, 15 to 20 years, so to speak, it's been dominated by a handful of schools. Fresno State, Boise State, Air Force, and San Diego State have combined to take home 15 of 20 all-time spots in the Mountain West Conference Championship. And I guess before we get into the individual programs, and we'll break all of them down at least in some level of detail, are there any particular programs right now in the current landscape of the Mountain West that you'd be looking to buy or sell based on coaching, based on facilities, upward trends? I mean, I know it's a league that's very close to us both living out here in the desert, but at the same time, it hasn't quite felt like these teams can compete on the big stage like we would have seen a handful of years ago with Boise and Fresno at the top of their game.
No, I mean, I'll start with, you mentioned those 4 schools. It just so happens those 4 schools, if I'm stack ranking power ratings right now, those are the top 4 at the league. No shocker there with Boise State, Fresno State, Air Force, and San Diego State leading the way. There was a couple of schools that I think at least have higher ceilings than what they've been the last 4 or 5 years. I'll start locally, and I'm not being a homer. I think UNLV playing in Allegiant with the new Fertitta complex, the $30 million facility there for their practices and whatnot. I mean, there was a time where, this is a little bit in the weeds, but for the Las Vegas Bowl, the one team got a chance, I don't know if they won a coin flip or not, got a chance to pick where they're going to use UNLV's facilities to practice in leading up to game week or Bishop Gorman's. And they would pick Bishop Gorman's facilities, the local high school here. So that's how bad it used to be for UNLV just a couple of years ago. So obviously with the talent, the population growth here, I mean, this is moving towards a $3 million population as far as the people living in just Las Vegas Valley. So UNLV, I think they showed it with some raised expectations, firing a coach after a 5-7 season. They would be there. The program that I'm more confident in that can, I've seen them at their top. I know it's getting dated now, but man, the late 90s, early 2000s under Sonny Lubick, Colorado State was a legitimate program. And I mean, consistently ranked in the top 25. And they spend like a borderline Power 5 team. They got a new 200, it's relatively new in the last 5 years as far as their football stadium, $200+ million there. They poached the Nevada coach to show you that they pay much more than the other teams in the conference. They're the sneaky team, I think, that can, maybe raise up and at least get in the mix here with these other 4 teams.
I have to think when you talk about programs in the league, and obviously conference realignment is always something that is very near and dear to college football fans. And bettors to some extent, but obviously not quite the same. They hang a number on it. We're going to bet it. I don't really care what address you're keeping or who you're playing on a week-in, week-out basis, but so much swirling around San Diego State potentially going to the Pac-12. They'll have to make a decision at the end of the month, most likely. You mentioned UNLV and quickly becoming one of the potential crown jewels, not for a true Power 5 conference, since we'll put that Pac-12 kind of as a intermediary, the way things are going there, but obviously a much more attractive market. And Colorado State, I mean, I've talked to people in and around the Denver-Fort Collins area that think that this program has really done a disservice, knowing the amount of money that they've plunked into it, to your point, that they don't get more serious consideration for the Big 12 as to be one of those members. But the way you're going to change the narrative is going out there winning football games, and I at least think they're headed in the right direction. I will say, though, when I was doing a little bit of research on Colorado State, it's absolutely brutal on the internet because one of the first search terms when you put in Colorado State football, Brad, that comes back on Google is has Colorado State football ever been good? So it tells you that even the internet forgets those Sonny Lubick days and Bradley Van Pelt out there running around trying to keep this team relevant. But before we get into the teams themselves, I mean, you uncovered some great nuggets that I think are great from a perspective standpoint that a lot of our listeners would appreciate. So do you want to share some of those in terms of what the Mountain West did last year from a body of work standpoint, how the power ratings have changed, and a lot of the other dynamics in and around this league?
So we've been talking about a lot of the group of five as a whole, MAC, that we just did. I mean, as far as the power rating dropping, man, I don't have any more positive news to share as far as this league goes, as far as where they're trending. Last year arguably was the worst season ever for the Mountain West. I mean, this is a 25-year-old league now at this point, and I don't think there's any question it was the worst. Look no further. I mean, Nevada, Hawaii, New Mexico were three of the bottom five teams in the country in my power ratings. 3 of the 5 were Mountain West teams. And then I just look at the trend line on each individual team's season. I didn't upgrade a single team in the conference by more than 1 point, and on average dropped them throughout the course of the season more than 3 points on average. So it wasn't probably set up to be a good season to begin with the new coaches, and all 4 of those new coaches were what we call year 0, not even year 1, because they just had nothing really to work with as far as returning production or experience. But that still doesn't, in my opinion, excuse his 3 losses to FCS teams last year, and some of them were blowouts. This is a conference that was, right there in the mix. My first job in the industry I was a Mountain West Conference coordinator at Phil Steele, and at the time they had BYU, Utah, TCU, all those 3 teams kind of at their top of their game. Certainly, this conference is a far cry from that. I mean, they haven't gotten the New Year's 6 group of 5 bid since 2014, almost a decade. I just think, so what's happening here? Well, I can't talk about population, shifting or anything like that I could with the MAC. I just think specifically to last year, horrific quarterback play. I mean, when half the teams in your league are in the bottom 25 in pass efficiency, that's a problem. I think it'll be a little bit better this year, but I still, you're still going to be longing for those days from 10, 15 years ago.
It's such an interesting league on a variety of fronts because you get such weird recruiting bases. And I know that's kind of becoming the norm for a lot of these leagues that aren't geographically located. The MAC probably one that still maintains its footprint better than anybody else, the Big Ten to a lesser extent. But you have California kids trying to figure out where they're going to factor in. You have a brand of football in Laramie, Wyoming that's going to set the game back 100 years more often than not. And so you look at these teams trying to play to your strengths. But to your point, when you have had some of these big names at the quarterback positions come through, they haven't even elevated the league overall in the last handful of years. So we'll see exactly what we have, and we'll get into some of the teams themselves. And I guess when we talk Mountain West football, we may as well start with the gold standard, so to speak, a team that has been the perennial power and the big behemoth on the block. And last year notwithstanding, when they found themselves on the wrong end of a Mountain West Conference championship game loss, that being the Boise State Broncos. And you look at Boise, they're a shade less than 2-1 to win the league this season. We've seen some movement on their win total. Believe it did open as high as 9 in some spots, 8.5 shaded to the under. Andy Avalos, defensive-minded head coach, accomplished plenty as a player here up on that Smurf turf. They go 8-0 last year Mountain West Conference play, winning the division by 3 games over Air Force. Once they made a change to Talon Green at quarterback, the season swung after an abysmal loss to UTEP, a game, Brad, that I'm unwilling to admit that I actually watch in its entirety with an under ticket. And when you look at Boise, though, Avalos is one thing as a head coach. Dirk Cutter stepped in last year and was able to get this offense going. Now, maybe it was because of competition more so than Green's skill set than anything else. But when you look at the way this program is trending, Bush Hamden comes over from Missouri. Is there reason to believe that Boise can pick up where they left off? Or is it going to be mired in mediocrity again when they go through what appears to be a very difficult non-conference schedule?
Tells you how they've come as a program when mediocrity is 10 wins and people aren't that excited. I mean,
Jared Zabransky's not walking through that door anytime
neither
soon.
Neither is Kellen Moore, and Chris Peterson isn't either. They didn't like Brian Harsin, who consistently won. And, obviously he didn't turn out well at Auburn, but, this is still the flag-bearing program of this conference by a margin, in my opinion. I like the personnel. I am really concerned about the downgrade at OC. I don't think it was just Talon Green. I thought it was specifically Dirk Cutter coming in. He got his start as a Boise State head coach, believe it or not. He changed their season. And I made some money there. Those first 3-4 games where they made that change to Green and Dirk Cutter calling plays, that was some of the biggest bets I made all season because that just did not get appropriately priced in the market. Speaking of the personnel, the skill, everybody's back. Starts with Talon Green. And if you haven't watched any Boise State football, exciting kid, exciting prospect. I'll be anxious if he has a good year this year. I'll be excited. Interesting to see if they can hold on to this kid because he's 6'6", 215. I thought he did what he had to do passing. Obviously, he needs to improve, but he, for the most part, took care of the football. He's a good athlete, ran for 10 touchdowns. He killed me against Utah State where he ran for a 90-yard touchdown. Then there's a pick six in the final minute of the game.
Oh, that game was absolutely awful. 100% wrong side, just wrong result if you had a Utah State ticket there in the final week of the season.
One of the worst beats in history, where a 17-point underdog with a minute and a half left has a chance to win the game outright, and somehow you don't cover the point spread.
I shouldn't laugh, but the only reason we laugh at these things is to keep us from crying, Brad. So go ahead.
Yeah, I might have cried a little bit on that one. That one hurt deeply on the day after Thanksgiving. I mean, it could have been indigestion too from the turkey. But getting back to Taylon Green, dynamic athlete. One thing I like better than Taylon Green is that running back duo with Helani and this freshman kid, Genty, who's, I think, a dynamic athlete, really flashed in the bowl game where he ran for like 180 yards. He had a great spring game as well. To me, with George Helani and Ashton Genty, that's the best 1-2 punch at running back in the entire group of five and would rival, I know a lot of Power 5 teams that would love that. They got their top wide receiver back. I don't think he's an explosive kid, but that Caples kid is all right. So I think the pieces are there at the skill position. I think they take a step back as far as play calling, but, man, personnel-wise, it should be the best offense in the Mountain West.
You mentioned Genty and some interesting nuggets about what exactly he accomplished last year, and he was actually the highest-graded true freshman in college football during the 2022 season, according to Pro Football Focus, earned an overall grade a shade less than 90 and was among the top 15 FBS running backs in both overall grade and rushing grade. Of his 821 yards rushing, 74% of those came after contact, a top 10 rate among group of 5 running backs. So clearly the metrics support what your eye test is telling you, Brad, and this kid is going to be an absolute thorn in Mountain West defensive coordinators' game planning going forward. But we mentioned defensive coordinators, and one of the things that we've seen from Boise over the years is all the talk is about their offense, but the defense oftentimes gets undersold. What are your expectations for what the stop unit is going to look like up there in the Treasure Valley?
So this is complete opposite of the offense, where I got some concerns about the personnel, but I do love Avalos as far as a defensive mind. And I know he's not the defensive coordinator, but he's a very defensive-minded, oriented head coach. And even though this is a defense that loses a couple starters in the NFL draft, only 5 starters are back, it was number 6 in the country in total defense a year ago. And I'm a little bit worried about the depth. Anytime you have a relatively inexperienced, as far as returning talent at the G5 level, but I think the starting 11 will be fine as long as they don't get banged up. It's led by DJ Schramm, a linebacker, a 100-plus tackle guy. The guy that they kind of like to shore up maybe the inside is this transfer defensive tackle from Northern Arizona. That's 328 pounds. You don't typically get a lot of that at this level. So Sheldon Newton is his name, so keep an eye on him. But even though they're lightly experienced, I don't know. Avalos has only put forth good defenses at Boise State, and I would expect nonetheless this year.
Last thing on Boise schedule, when you look at what the Broncos have right out of the gates, a very difficult test, and they'll travel up to Seattle to take on Washington. They'll follow that up with a home game against UCF, a little bit of a layup against FCS member North Dakota, and then they play back-to-back road games, including on a Friday night in conference at San Diego State, and they'll have an extra day to prepare when they travel out to the Liberty Bowl to take on Memphis. Doesn't seem to be the softest landing spot before things get to be much more manageable, at least on paper, in terms of the heart of the Mountain West Conference schedule.
Yeah, and I am a part of that early money on that under 9, and it really had to do with I wasn't questioning talent level or anything like that. I still in a power rating had Boise State number 1. It was this schedule. It's the toughest in the Mountain West, and by margin, in my opinion. So, man, those 3 non-conference games, none of them easy. Obviously, significant underdog against Washington. Even though they get UCF at home, they could be even a short home underdog there. And at Memphis, if it was at home, I would like their chances against Memphis. But, man, going across the country, that'll be interesting. And then, 2 of the better teams in the Mountain West, you got to go to their place in San Diego State and Fresno State, by far the toughest schedule. So a reason for me why I bet under 9 when that opened up.
Hey, look, I mean, the schedule is the great equalizer in college football. You can be more talented, and it may not show up in the wins and losses column.
Yep.
And that's oftentimes how we'll identify value on a week-to-week standpoint, more so than looking at the full body of work. From the team that lost in the conference championship game to the team that won it, in the Fresno State Bulldogs. And when you look at their win total, we'll call it a consensus 8. I know there's some different numbers out there. They find themselves right around plus 375 to win the Mountain West. Jeff Tedford in his second season, he'll have to do business without Jake Haener, Jordan Mims, and a very talented receiving core. I don't want to sell Tedford short, Brad, because of what he's been able to accomplish at various stops along the way. I mean, this is a guy who's won or shared 3 conference titles and won 118 games in 15 years as a college head coach. But it almost feels like it can be perceived as a transition year, knowing Tedford's fingerprints typically benefit the offense, and there are a lot more questions on that side of the ball than there were last year, unless you truly believe in Mikey Keene or Logan Fife to pick up right where Jake Haener left off.
Yeah, so I was expecting to maybe be down on Fresno State, but it's all you give me, like you mentioned at the top. I mean, you give me a price on anybody, I'll bet honor against anybody. So I was expecting to be a little negative on Fresno State, just because I think Jake Haener, I thought the world of him. Don't believe me? I mean, look at no further than their season. He's banged up at the start of the year. They start off 1-4. He gets healthy, and they run off 9 straight wins to end the season. So this is a team, if he was healthy all year, probably would have won another game or two. So in that regard, maybe a little bit undervalued, but do not like the returning, at least experience at the skill position. I thought Jordan Mims was a really good running back. Losing their top 3 receivers. I like that Cal transfer, Remigio. Their top 3 receivers combined for more than 2,500 yards. They're all gone. The OC's gone. So I do think even with Tedford's experience and forte on the offense side of the ball, they're going to take a probably even a significant step back on that side of the ball. They bring in a ton of transfers. A lot of guys that, from even Power 5 positions, but not like well-to-do names, so I think there's some uncertainty there. Same thing with defense. They lose, some of their best players. That Perales kid off the edge was really good at defensive end. Evan Williams was good on the back end. I think the secondary would be fine, but I thought that was 2 of their best players. They're both gone. They bring in, again, some transfers. Even with all the uncertainty, though, Todd, they're better than the San Jose States, the Utah States of the world. So I think they'll certainly contend for the Mountain West again, even with a lightly experienced team.
It's such an interesting team because obviously when you think Fresno State, you think quarterback lineage. And Jake Haener obviously reunited with one of his former Fresno State brethren that'll learn the NFL game down in New Orleans. But you've seen it time and time again, whether it's a Carr legacy or somebody else, they can move the ball offensively. But defensively last year, to your point, I mean, this is a group that ranked in the top 15 in FBS scoring defense, holding opponents to less than 20 points per game. Now, that does, of course, come with the caveat that you mentioned at the top of the show that the Mountain West wasn't exactly quarterback you up and down the board. So when you have athletes in space, they can go out and make differences. They're going to be able to really pay dividends. For Fresno State, when we look at their schedule, I know Pat Hill made it very ubiquitous that it was going to be anytime, any place, anywhere. I'm not sure going to West Lafayette to take on Purdue and going to Tempe to take on Arizona State is the same thing that he would have liked back in the day. But what do you make of Fresno State's non-conference schedule before they get into the Mountain West?
First, let me say, the defense doesn't get enough credit. They've had, in the last 6 years, they've had 4 double-digit win seasons. Every one of those 4 years, they had a top 20 scoring defense. But I'm not sure that this year's defense compares to those 4. So a little bit of step back there. But I think you hit on it. The schedule isn't that difficult. I wouldn't be stunned if they won one of those 2 opening games at Purdue or at Arizona State. They'll be short underdogs in both games. Boise State's at home. I'm not a big fan of San Diego State. We'll get into that here in a minute, but I mean, when you look at it just on paper, even with downgrading this team about a touchdown from my end-of-year power ratings, I still have 6 games where they're a double-digit favorite, and obviously a lot of other games where they're going to be a short dog or it's a pick-em situation or a short favorite. But one of the reasons why I bet over 7.5 wins for this team and laid some heavy juice on that. Wasn't afraid.
Always an interesting program to try and watch. We can only hope that Jeff Tedford's health stays intact and he can continue to build this program back into what it was when he was here for his first stint. From Fresno in the Central Valley of California to Colorado Springs and the altitude of the Air Force Academy, when we look at Troy Calhoun's bunch, Air Force's win total 8.5 shaded to the under at some spots. You're looking at them just north of 4-1. To win the division, and last year they completed their 3rd straight 10-win season. If you back out the COVID-shortened 2020 season, only Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, Ohio State, Utah, and Oregon have been able to match that level of consistency. When you look at Air Force, one of the things that came up, Brad, when you were reading some of the coaching comments and all of that, schedule doesn't exactly do them any favors, but they're trying to spin it as a positive. They'll play in 5 time zones during a 9-week stretch. From the Houston to Honolulu stretch, Calhoun said, we recruit nationally within all 5 time zones, so it's kind of neat to have a chance to play in each one of them too. When we look at their coaching staff, a longtime assistant in Chuck Peterson returns from Navy. The clear identity in Colorado Springs is simple. Lead the nation in rushing yards, try and take care of the time of possession and total defense. But some changes on the offensive side, and I know we broke down Navy in our AAC preview, and you talked about an unusual amount of continuity for the mids. Air Force probably not going to be afforded that same luxury, especially on the offensive side, where there are plenty of questions that abound at a lot of the skill positions, most notably quarterback.
Yeah, Daniel's a quarterback, a 3-year starting quarterback. Didn't get approval as far as getting another year. At one point he was not in good standing with the academy, so I think maybe some of that past stuff, hurt him there. But he was a guy that, never got enough credit as a passer. And of the 3 academies, I worry least about Air Force because they have already been passing at least a little bit more than Army and Navy in that regard with the rules changes. But he's gone. I mean, Brad Roberts was incredibly productive as a fullback. Don't believe me? He led the nation in rushing with over 1,700 yards and 17 touchdowns. Their wide receiver, their top guy, is out. I mean, 400-plus yards. That's a lot for an academy as far as at the wide receiver position. So certainly at skill, it's going to be some question marks there. They seem to like, as far as the favorite to win the starting job at quarterback is Jensen Jones. He was the backup last year. He's not the best runner of the 3. He's not the best passer of the 3, but I guess he's the best combo. One thing I will say that I like, I mean, when you got 4 returning starters on that offensive line, and Air Force has had one of the better offensive lines, that's a good place to start at the academy. If your offensive line's set, it's almost plug and play with this offense as long as my quarterback's not turning it over via the pitch and whatnot, I think you'll be just fine.
When you look at Air Force defensively, I know what some of the counting stats tell you. They're a little bit different than the efficiency numbers. Obviously, a defense benefits, to be brutally honest, by spending less time on the field than some of their opponents. And last year, they were exposed to the fewest number of plays and drives per game of any team in the FBS. So when you look at Air Force, they deserve credit, obviously, as they've built a defense to complement what they want to do offensively. Their goal is to create havoc and get the hell off the damn field. They did a tremendous job of that late in the campaign. Do you feel it's as simple as rinse and repeat, as they've really figured out the recipe for putting a good stop unit out there year in, year out over the last handful of seasons?
Yeah, I think they have, and I was worried last year because they lost their defensive coordinator. It was pretty well renowned. He went to Virginia. I was worried there, but they didn't miss a beat. I mean, obviously number 1 in the country in total defense. I get it. They're not on the field much because of the style of play on offense, but let's give them credit too. I mean, they got off the field themselves. Last 2 games of the year, San Diego State and Baylor were combined 0 for 21 on third down. So Air Force's defense was a big reason they weren't on the field. They prevented that. So I like the defensive tackle, that Zoidrick. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation.
I was going to let you make the pronunciation there because I sure as hell wasn't going down that rabbit hole.
I should have rewatched the bowl game because that's the game that he impressed me. I do like him. He's a disruptor on the interior. With 8 returning starters, and you mentioned it doesn't happen very often at the academies to get 8 guys back. They're going to be one of the better defenses, at least statistically, in the country.
Yeah, when you look at Air Force's schedule, too, and we've talked about some of the Mountain West teams that are really challenging themselves outside of conference play, the Falcons wouldn't fall into that particular bucket with Robert Morris, a de facto neutral, against Sam Houston State, a transitional member from the FCS. And then you look at their annual showdown against Navy Week 8 and, of course, Army Week 10. So 2 service academies, 2 group of 5 programs, not even a group of 5, 1 group of 5, 1 FCS. So Air Force may have an opportunity to fatten up their record there. We will see exactly what Troy Calhoun is able to do, as he's really kept this as the most consistent of the service academies over the last little bit. You mentioned San Diego State a bit earlier, and it's now time for the Aztecs to come under the microscope, led by Brady Hoke, yet again another head coach in the Mountain West, who's in his second stint making moves. Talked a little bit about the Aztecs at the top. They built a beautiful new stadium that they unveiled last year at Snapdragon. There's been all sorts of talk about how this could be a transitional market, so it would allow the Pac-12 to have a footprint in Southern California. We're going to continue to want to monitor that. It appears that the deadline for them to make that decision, or the Pac-12 in general, would be June 30th before their exit fee would double to roughly $34 million. When you look at the Aztecs, they've won or shared 3 Mountain West Conference football titles in the past 11 years, and they've been bowl eligible for 13 years running. The problem for San Diego State is that they've been often a bridesmaid, very rarely a bride. Haven't won the league since 2016. Did have a stretch where they ripped off seasons of double-digit wins in 7 years from 2015 to 2021. When we look at the Aztecs' schedule coming in, Brad, it does them no favors early. And instead of talking about their offensive and defensive units, I mean, this schedule, Ohio right out of the gates, Oregon State, Boise State, and Air Force, they better hope that Jaden Malden is clicking on all cylinders under Ryan Lindley in his first true year as offensive coordinator.
Yeah, I mean, they better, because they certainly weren't last year. And, obviously this is a program that's relied heavily on defense and special teams, and offense has left a lot to be desired. But, yeah, you mentioned it, and I mentioned this in the MAC preview, that if you're looking for a game to sit down that'll give you a good barometer of what these teams are going to be in week 0, man, that Ohio-San Diego State game is really intriguing to me. And then they'll be up against it in a lot of their other games. I mean, I do have them an underdog in 5 of their 12 games, so I'm not surprised that the win total is sitting there at 6.5, 7 in a lot of spots, even with their track record of, like you mentioned, in recent history of getting the double-digit wins. I'll give Maiden the benefit of the doubt. He's playing safety at the beginning of last season, and then they did a little bit better with him under center. As far as offense, it's all relative. I mean, I don't know if 23.5 points per game is all that great, but it was at least better than what they were at the start of the season. So, sure. I mean, I think they'll have opportunities, especially against Ohio. We'll see. What made their offense at least halfway decent for a long period, if you remember, I mean, they weren't afraid to pump out, 1,000-yard rushers, 2 of them at a time. Pumphrey kid, was one of the all-time leaders in the history of the NCAA as far as all-time leading rushers. They haven't been able to run the football even lately.
Yeah, I mean, and you look at some of those San Diego State backs that we've seen in the past. I mean, these guys weren't exactly hulking NFL types coming in at 6'2", 225. They look more like Darren Sproles at 5'8", $175. And when they got to that second level, it was a career-limiting move for safeties in the Mountain West to step in front of them and try and tackle. But you're right. I mean, you need an offensive line to kind of be able to pave that way, and they really haven't had much of that. We'll see. There is a little bit of returning production as far as the receiving room is concerned with Shaw and Redmond. That should hopefully help those guys out. Now, defensively, look, San Diego State, this is the one thing that they've been able to hang their hat on for years, whether it was Rocky Long calling the plays on that side of the ball, or the overall culture that they'd built. They were going to go out there. They were going to hit you every single play. But this defense, at least on paper right now, going to be a retooling unit, and there are some major questions specifically in the front 7.
There is, because, I mean, I'm watching that bowl game, and I'm not going to talk too much more than that. If you had a San Diego State ticket, my goodness, unbelievable.
Quality time on Christmas Eve watching San Diego State, Middle Tennessee State. And unfortunately, they're moving the Hawaii Bowl now. It won't be on Christmas Eve because of the way the schedule falls. It'll be on December 23rd.
That's kind of sad. That was a tradition of watching the Hawaii Bowl on Christmas Eve. A lot of fond memories. Last year wasn't one of them, when San Diego State literally could have taken a knee on every offensive play after they got up 2 touchdowns and probably won the game, but decided, no, let's throw the football. Tavai and Banks on this defense at defensive end dominated that bowl game, to say the least, and had really productive seasons. They're both gone. 5 of the 6 gone on the defensive front. I'm worried. The secondary looked to be returned and completely intact. They had their second leading tackler, that Patrick McMorris kid, transferred out, went to Cal after the spring. So that's kind of a concern. So I know their reputation on that side of the ball, and it seems to be plug and play, but as of right now, I think there's more question marks than answers on defense.
Yeah, and unfortunately for the Aztecs, mentioned that schedule, and I think I butchered it going through. This is how their schedule sets up. Beginning in week 0, they'll get Ohio at home. They'll get a little bit of a respite against Idaho State, a home game against UCLA. You talked about Mountain West teams being featured on national TV. That'll be a game on CBS. They'll go up to Corvallis to take on Oregon State. And then if you were looking for a soft landing spot to kick off conference play, you get Boise at home on a Friday night and travel to Colorado Springs to take on Air Force before their bye comes in week 6, when it feels like the entire Mountain West will have that week off. So we'll get a pretty good indication of exactly what Brady Hoke has in the uphill battle that they may face when the schedule lightens up considerably during the second half. From Southern California, though, we'll head up the coast to San Jose State, a program we touched on a little bit towards the top of the show. Their win total, 5.5, heavily juiced at some spots. We're looking at a win total that sits right around 13. And for San Jose State, they're going to get a chance to showcase everything on national TV. Brad, you mentioned it. They'll play on CBS at home against Oregon State on Sunday, September 3rd at 12:30 to open the Spartan Athletic Center. Why is that notable? Well, it'll be the first time the Spartans have played a regular season game on big CBS since their 35-35 win over Stanford on September 18th back in 1982. And their first Sunday game since November 8th in 2009 against Nevada. So Group of 5 programs getting an opportunity to show their mettle on a big stage. If there's one thing we know about San Jose State, Brad, it's we should have a little bit of confidence in Chevin Cordero and what he means under center. Completed 61% of his passes last year, 23-6 touchdown interception ratio, 4 300-yard passing games, and a 100-yard rushing game. But things won't exactly be easy for him as he loses his top receiver in Elijah Cooks. Isaiah Hamilton expected to step up in that receiving core, transfers as well. But there are some reasons to be excited for what Coach Brennan's team can put on the field from an offensive standpoint.
Yeah, so I'll take it back to last year. This was a team that really greatly exceeded expectations at the start. You're thinking, this team might win the Mountain West. And then, unfortunately, they had a tragic loss, scooter accident. One of their players actually died. And that really seemed to wreck the program because they didn't cover any of their last 7 games last season. So to flip that forward, usually teams that really struggle against the spread, sometimes I find them to be on the cheap side entering the season. I didn't think that was necessarily the case this year, but one thing I do like, you mentioned there are some pieces on offense, starting with Cordero. All 5 starters back on the offensive line. That is something that I do look at that I know at least early on in the process doesn't always get properly accounted for in the pricing. So good to have a bunch of experience there, but there's question marks because you mentioned Elijah Cooks, I thought was their top offensive playmaker. The Hamilton kid's going to be really productive at Washington State this year. They were expecting a Montana State transfer at running back, and then he decided after transferring from Montana State, post-spring, I'm going to transfer again. I'm going to go to California. So, he's going to go across the bay there a little bit to Cal. So that was a little bit of a hit for them. So I don't know. I'm kind of meandering a little bit because I think this offense will be pretty much on par from what they were a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, this is a program, too, a couple of years ago during the COVID-shortened season that really burst onto the scene. Coach Brennan got them playing at levels we didn't think were capable in San Jose State. For anybody that's been watching college football for years or as long as you have, I mean, this was a perennial doormat. It was a job that nobody wanted to take. It was a very difficult place to recruit to, and it was much more of a commuter school. I'm not sure they fall back to that particular basement, but it'll be interesting to see what they're able to sustain, especially on the offensive side. Now, defensively, they also had some losses. The most notable is a player that you couldn't help but spot every time you flipped on a San Jose State game in Fehoko, just running around like a crazy man trying to knock down everything in front of him. When we look at the Spartans defensively, reason to be optimistic, or do you think this is a group that has more questions than they do answers?
No, I'm a little bit more certain in the fact that this is a group in units going to take a step back, maybe even a big step back this year. I mean, not only do you lose Fehoko, who was the Mountain West Player of the Year on the defensive side last year, Cade Hall in that season that they won the Mountain West, he was the Mountain West Defensive Player of the Year that season and had 12 tackles for loss a year ago, so multiple-year starter there. You lose your middle linebacker, Harmon, multiple-year starter, 100-plus tackles a year ago. So, man, to lose your top 3 guys, and you mentioned Fehoko, I mean, they thought, well, enough of him to be taken in the 4th round of the draft. So it was a legit defense last year, top 35 scoring, rushing, total defense, but do not expect them to come anywhere close to that. And yes, I did watch the San Jose State spring game. It was unique. It was played on a 75-yard field due to the construction going on, so I didn't get a great look. But one thing I did look at, the defense looked undersized in the spring, and for me to notice that, keep that an eye out on that. Especially week 1 there on that Sunday, an Oregon State team that likes to play bully ball. Having an undersized defense might not be a good look.
Yeah, I mean, traveling to the Coliseum to take on USC week 0, and then following it up the next week.
I forgot about that.
Playing Oregon State at home. So San Jose State will either go out there and exceed expectations, or there may be an excellent opportunity for a bounce-back spot when they get a Cal Poly team that's going through a transition in their own right, with Troy Taylor leaving there to take over at Stanford.
Oh, he was at Sacramento State.
Oh, Sacramento State. Sorry, you are correct there, and that's why you are the FCS maven, whereas I just try and make sure I don't embarrass myself, which I did there. So appreciate you always point it out. You got to keep me honest, otherwise our listeners will do that, and I'd rather hear it from you and Payne, Mr. Brad. San Jose.
They're gonna get on you. I think you said San Jose State's win total was 13. So
no.
You'll get that in the mentions.
13-1 to win the league. Their win total 5.5.
Oh, okay,
if their win total's at 13, everyone should run out there and max bet it going under. Because I don't think they're going to be able to win 13 games in a 12-game regular season schedule. So that much I'm confident in. There are very few certainties in sports gambling, but I don't think San Jose State is going to go 13-0 this year. Now, granted, I've said worse things, and we'll see if that comes back to haunt me should they upset USC and Oregon State right out of the gates. From San Jose State, though, to Laramie, and we talk about a very different atmosphere and culture around those two programs. This is probably a full 180 between those teams. And what I find interesting, Brad, when you comb around on some of these Mountain West websites, first off, it looks like the same website designer designs them all. So maybe they have an exclusive contract because they all fit what appears to be a similar template, or maybe it's an undergraduate student. If that undergraduate student that's listening to the podcast didn't mean to take a shot at any of their handiwork by any stretch. But what I found interesting is the number one story on Wyoming's website for their football program is about how excited they were to bringing new field turf to Laramie. And when we look at War Memorial Stadium, 7,200 feet above sea level, it's the country's highest NCAA Division I football stadium, where Wyoming has won 66% of their home games in the stadium's history. But with Wyoming, we can say what we want about thin air. The only thing that was thin air in their passing game was their ability to find open ground and bounce passes when Andrew Peasley was under center. Craig Bohl wants to play one way. It's conservative, it's physical, it's bully ball in the trenches, but that'll only get you so far in the current college football landscape.
Yeah, I mean, when you only go for 6% of the time on fourth down, by far the lowest in the FBS, that's conservative, folks. You mentioned the quarterback play. It just has to be better. I mean, I'm not asking Andrew Peasley to be Josh Allen, but I mean, when you're only completing 52% and your touchdown interception ratio is basically even, just it's not gonna work. I mean, you're not throwing, you can't complete your passes, and your yards per attempt is bottom 10 nationally. I mean, they're not asking them to throw the ball 50 yards down the field consistently. So that has to be better for this offense to be much more productive. The one thing I am a little bit more confident in is the fact, they lose Titus Wynn. He was kicked off the team at the end of last season. They bring in a Northern Illinois transfer in Harrison Whaley that I expect to be a 1,000-yard rusher, plug and play. That he'll be, if you're looking if you're in the college football fantasy, and I know some people are, that would be a guy I'd pick up because I do expect some production there. They won't miss a beat. On the offense, man, they expected, to be one of the better offensive lines in the Mountain West, and I still think they can be there. But man, they lost their guard, that Pregnon kid, after post spring to USC, and I think he starts at USC, so that's a significant loss for them.
When we look at Wyoming offensively, you mentioned it. I mean, this is a team that wants to run the ball on first. They want to run the ball on second, and they want to run the ball on third, as long as it's not 3rd and 37. Defensively, for Craig Bohl, I mean, this is where this team has done a lot of its damage, although last year they struggled mightily against the run, which was extremely uncharacteristic. But he typically has a blueprint, and it's rinse and repeat for a lot of what they want to do. There were a number of players that were extremely young, thrust into action probably earlier than they were ready. But is there reason to be optimistic that this defense can be improved compared to what we saw on a week-in, week-out basis last year?
Yeah, I think it'll be improved. But I will say with this caveat, and I know Wyoming is the most experienced team in the Mountain West, at least coming back as far as returning production. There is a ceiling to their athletes I've seen, because they've been, many times in the last decade the most experienced team, and they still have this ceiling where they can't break through 8 wins. And I think a lot of it is athletically. Defense, sure, I don't mind them up front. Specifically, I like that middle linebacker Gibbs. I mean, in that style of defense, they just rack up tackles like crazy. If you go look at their leading tacklers the last 5-6 years, it's among the national leaders. Where do we see that athleticism fail to show up sometimes? I mean, they only had 6 interceptions last year. I mean, you got to force some turnovers. And you mentioned if you're not stopping the run like you're normally doing, and you're not forcing turnovers in the pass game, I mean, you could see why there was some inconsistency in their defensive performances a year ago.
I'll say one thing. If this team has, one area going for them that becomes their secret weapon, we don't talk a ton about special teams on our preseason previews, but my God, Brad, let me tell you, you can't read enough about John Hoyland anywhere you look in the Mountain West or Wyoming and what they want to talk about this kicker that basically gets himself into plus territory when Wyoming's inside the 40. So maybe if that's the case, you go for it more on third downs and try and just bleed the clock with some of the new clock rules there, and you're banging 55-yard field goals on a regular basis in that thin mountain air up there in Laramie week in, week out.
You mentioned it. I think it is easier to punt and kick. I have been there at 7,000 plus feet than it is at sea level. So, yeah, he's got the production. Kudos to him, but I'm anxious to see what he does consistently when he's not, kicking there at 7,200 feet.
Did you happen to do any wind sprints when you were up there visiting Laramie to figure out exactly what kind of cardiovascular fitness you had? Were you out there doing gassers, running 10-yard increments when you were walking around the facility?
No, I was not. My dad hit the sleds, though. They had some sleds in the end zone. He was having fun. Kudos to him for that. I didn't try that.
All right. I mean, as long as Papa Powers is out there trying to make it work a little bit and putting himself through that physical level of exertion, beautiful part of the country.
I was driving. That was my physical. He was sitting there. He could take a nap when I was driving. That's why he hit the sleds.
That becomes as mentally taxing as anything else for those folks that have driven through this part of the country. Absolutely beautiful to see. But let me tell you can go 4 to 5 hours without seeing another human anywhere else outside of some of the big rig truckers that are out there taking care of the West Coast. Laramie, one spot in the Mountain West. UNLV is a very different one. And when we look at this Rebels program coming into the season, 17-1, their going rate to win. No, 17 is not their win total, Brad. Their win total sits at 6. You can tell me a little bit more about where that may have opened or where it's moved since then. But this is a Rebels football program that has one winning season since 2005. One of the big focuses for Barry Odom when he came in and took over for Marcus Arroyo, who was a little bit of a surprise firing that obviously coincided with UNLV tailing off in that second half of the season, that Odom said he wanted to do a better job recruiting locally. And for those folks that don't know, Brad mentioned Bishop Gorman and some of the facilities there. Look, UNLV is not going to pull 4- and 5-star kids from Gorman and get them to UNLV, at least not right now. But there is an underrated high school football product here that if you're able to get that second tier and build with kids locally, it can go a long, long way. And that was one of the things that high school coaches had said, that Marcus Arroyo didn't want to recruit the area. There was no level of familiarity and there was no relationship. Odom has kind of taken a very different approach to it. And when you look at realistic expectations for a journeyman head coach, and I don't mean that in a negative context, but a guy who's coached and been able to realize results, especially on the defensive side at multiple stops along the way, what do we think the coaching transition is going to be like from Arroyo to Odom and their overall differences in philosophy? So,
bare bones, I think it's an upgrade. And I know people were stunned, shocked. I've seen. I think even one of the anonymous scouting reports was such a shocker that they fired Arroyo. I wasn't. I sat in the stands the last couple of years on a consistent basis when I wasn't, dealing with a parking situation, and I stood up.
Hey, I told you that parking situation we could sweep under the rug. You showed up to a Stanley Cup playoff game. It's officially off the books. It's sealed, Brad. That part of the ball busting is officially sealed going into the 2023 season.
Nah, it's all right. I deserve it. I wasn't surprised. And what was it? You mentioned some of the recruiting relationships. I don't think he had good relationships with the boosters, and there are some bigger name boosters. You had a new athletic director that didn't hire Arroyo. And I just look at the game management, the play calling. So sometimes I like going to games. I don't follow the ball. That's the beauty of going to a game. I'll look at, how are they getting plays in and out? I'll look at I'll pick a series. I'll just look at the offensive line. I'll pick a series, just look at the secondary. Again, I'll just look at the sideline for a series to see what's going on there. I constantly saw some confusion and whatnot. I did not like the game management. And if you don't believe me, I think it was a big reason why Marcus Arroyo and UNLV's 1-10 in one possession games. I don't think it's poor luck from what I saw. I thought it was poor management and poor coaching. So that was a team that should have been a bowl team a year ago. Odom's an upgrade, and I know he's got inexperienced coordinators, but, man, I really like his offensive coordinator, that Marion kid. I know he's only 35, but he does have some experience. He's been a coordinator, and he was a coordinator when he came into Las Vegas about 6 years ago with a Howard team and beat UNLV outright as a 45-point underdog, and that was his offense that did that. So I I'm pretty bullish. And you mentioned recruiting. This is in the weeds, and I feel like I could do an hour podcast on UNLV. I am passionate about them. They are in the top 40 right now in recruiting. I know it's early. It's the summer. We're talking for next year's recruiting class, but they are hitting guys locally already. They just got a linebacker out of Missouri. That's their highest-rated recruit in almost 2 decades. So I think you're already seeing some of the returns that this is going to be a good hire for UNLV.
And look, for those people that didn't watch UNLV last year, I mean, they have a quarterback in Doug Brumfield. We think he's going to be the starter unless something drastically changes, that has a level of athleticism. He's a kid that when he gets going can go out there and make defenses look silly when his decision-making isn't called into question. You have a transfer in Ricky White that when healthy can be a dynamic wide receiver, and a player that they like quite a bit in the spring game, not exactly the biggest fella by any stretch of the imagination, is Jacob DeJesus at 5'7", who they think they can deploy in a unique role to try and put opposing defenses into positions of conflict. So should be interesting to watch. And the one thing I will say, you mentioned UNLV football and everything going around. We're obviously closer to the program here, is they've talked about how they need to go about marketing this team, knowing that it's a much more difficult landscape in Las Vegas for share of wallet and for share of eyeballs. When you have the Raiders here, you have the Golden Knights, you potentially have the A's and an NBA team looming. I mean, the UNLV basketball team is what it is. It used to be the gold standard for, we'll call it Group of Five, but it was back when they were in the Big West playing Long Beach State annually and competing for national championships. There's no reason for UNLV with Allegiant Stadium, the footprint they have, the access. It's a hell of a lot easier, Brad, for recruits to get into Harry Reid Airport than it is to get to Laramie and some of the other spots in the conference if they want to try and explore this campus. So let's see if Barry Odom can be that guy to get them going. And this is before we even talked about Barry Odom and his strength, which is defense. You look at a group there, and they did some decent work in the transfer portal trying to upgrade that overall level of talent as well.
So historically, been really bad. Although last year was they've been bad, period. I mean, the offense or defense, and to pick one. First season last year, since 2007, they allowed less than 30 points per game. So there was already some signs last year. They do lose their top 2 players. Adam Plant was a really good defensive end for them, a TCU transfer, good kid as far as production. But he did a good job in the transfer portal, got kids from NC State, Arizona, LSU. I liked what I saw in the spring game in the secondary. I thought that was their strongest group. They were ball hawking to say the least in that spring game. Jackson Woodard from Arkansas, they really like that linebacker. He'll be the quarterback of the defense. Keep in mind, Odom coming from Arkansas, it'll be a very similar, he already knows the defense. So I think they'll be better even than a year ago. And again, last year's team was statistically scoring-wise the best they've had in 15 years.
Such an intriguing 2-game stretch for UNLV. Not week 1 and week 2 when they take on Bryant and they'll go to the Big House and get absolutely drummed by the Michigan Wolverines. But you get an SEC opponent in your building to take on Vanderbilt week 3.
Yep.
And then you go on the road in a non-conference game to take on UTEP. I'm not going to say winning both of those games would be massive for Barry Odom, but it would be massive if you can beat an SEC team in your building and not have a letdown the following week. So should be fascinating to see exactly what the Rebels can do. Bowl eligibility.
Let me say this, Todd. Even as happy, supporting UNLV and whatnot, I hope they don't win both those games because I bet under the win total. I'm part of the under 6.5. I mean, they've only won 7 games one time in the last 22 years. So I hope they don't win those 2 games for my pocketbook.
I can understand that. Look, it's money over mind when it comes to a lot of the stuff that's out there, and we'll see exactly where UNLV goes as a program. I'd be happy to see them get to a bowl game at 6-6 and try and rebuild some of what this program could be as a potential sleeping giant with the investment that we've seen. Up in Logan, Utah, they may not be as optimistic about their season outlook. When we look at the Utah State Aggies, 22-1 to win the conference. Their win total 5.5, shaded to the under. And coming out of spring practice, Brad, Blake Anderson said, "We are not the team we need to be yet, but there has been some steady improvement. There is still a lot to learn on both sides of the ball, but this spring was a good first step for this group. This summer is going to be critical, and I think we have a chance to be competitive, but we have to keep progressing." 5 straight years, they've experienced a 5+ game swing as a program, even before Blake Anderson took the reins. Last year, they dealt with a rash of injuries, but just reading those quotes doesn't lead me to believe that Anderson thinks they're going to be a dark horse to win the Mountain West by any stretch of the imagination.
No, and I don't like this team. This is another team I faded on some of the early season win total markets, and I think they've been fortunate to say the least, especially obviously when they won the Mountain West a couple years ago, but they were fortunate even to be 6-7 a year ago. The last 2 years, they're 8-0 in one-possession games. I just think that screams regression. this year. I am intrigued to see what Blake Anderson can do calling the plays offensively. Cooper Legas back at quarterback for them. But all the guys that impressed me offensively, at least skill position, running back Tyler, Cobbs at wide receiver, they're gone. And then, I mean, defensively, everybody transferred out. I mean, it seems like. And there were some guys that I thought were pretty good. Wasn't the only one. Like that Byron Vaughn's kid at defensive end went to Baylor. The other productive kid at defensive end is now at Cincinnati. So they lost a bunch. They weren't good defensively a year ago, and they lost everybody. So I don't know where that puts them. I am not very optimistic.
Yeah, I'm not sure that things will be ideal for Utah State either. Out of the gates, they'll travel to Kinnick Stadium to take on Iowa. Schedule a little bit more manageable after that, but could be a rough rebuilding campaign in Logan for Blake Anderson and company, even if they get their quarterback situation under control. And it's never good, Brad, when in the Athlon scouting reports an opposing coach says they were smart in the portal and landed a lot of athletic guys on defense because last year they didn't have any size or speed. I don't have to be a rocket scientist. If you don't have size or speed on a defense in college football, even if you're playing in the Mountain West, not necessarily going to translate to getting a lot of victories.
No. Yeah, I just didn't see it and don't see it, at least looking at them right now. Losing season is what I'm projecting.
Colorado State, a little bit of a program that I think can be on the upward trajectory. I'm not quite sure if it'll necessarily manifest as early as 2023. Their win total, 4.5, at least, most books that I've spotted. You look at their price to win the league, 34-1. They have a very unique scheduling quirk where they'll take on a Power 5 opponent in Washington State right out of the gates. They'll get their bye week 2, and then they'll play 11 straight games.
Good point.
Probably not ideal, Brad, for a program that's still looking to build its overall depth. Jay Norvell is a hell of a coach. He's got a good quarterback in Clay Millen, but the one thing they're going to need to do is do a much better job keeping any of their quarterbacks upright. They allowed 59 sacks last season. It was the worst in the FBS.
So I see a lot of positives here. We mentioned just the commitment this program has. I mean, not only with the relatively new stadium, the fact that they poached, the head coach from Nevada says that they're going to spend a lot more money than the typical average team in this conference. I like we're seeing the recruiting class, best recruiting class in a couple decades for them. Not that they, all the freshmen are going to come in and contribute right away, but at least down the road. One freshman that did contribute, you mentioned it, and when Millen's completing 72%, and he's got pressure in his face on almost every one of those passes. Kudos to him. I don't even care if you're throwing a 5-yard screen pass. I mean, when you got consistent pressure, kudos for that kid, and he took care of the football. Leading rushers back. I think they have a really good wide receiver. That Horton kid's one of the better in the Mountain West. So
yeah, he's a fun watch. I mean, for an offense that didn't offer a lot of punch last year, you would notice, Sam, when you watch Colorado State football games, that Horton was the only player opposing defenses had a scheme for, and they still couldn't shut him down consistently.
And, hopefully, I mean, maybe he's open a little bit more when the quarterback's got a little bit more time to throw. That's the question mark. The offensive line can't be any worse. Just how improved can it be? If it's much improved, then I can see this team, even with the scheduling quirk that's not in their favor, to say the least, I can see this team making a run towards bowl eligibility.
Yeah, I mean, last year, what's wild about it, they finished 3-5 in the Mountain West. They never scored more than 17 points in a conference game. And let me tell you, Brad, the 3.5 hours I committed to watching their game in its entirety against Air Force, or 3.5 hours of my life I'm never going to get back. And it was basically clinging to hope that the defense was bend but don't break, and that Air Force would settle for field goals in those particular spots. And it wasn't stopping it to provide.
Why were you so invested in these Colorado State games?
I have no idea. There are these teams that every year I feels like at least one in the Mountain West that I watch an inordinate amount of their games. A couple years ago, it was San Jose State. Last year, it was Colorado State. I have no idea what that team will be this year. Maybe it's New Mexico. Maybe it's Hawaii. I haven't quite figured it out yet. It normally doesn't happen until the middle of October. And it feels like I am on a first name basis with the CBS Sports Network crew that's calling the late night game that only the true degenerates are out there watching. But Colorado State's strength and the reason they were somewhat competitive was because of what they were doing on the defensive side. They allowed less than 20 points per game in conference play. They return a lot of starters. And for a group that was basically gashed early in the year, getting drummed every single week, the fact that this unit didn't quit is probably a credit to the coaching staff. And a lot of the things that I read around this team coming in, it's not necessarily the production that they return by any stretch of the imagination. It's they're saying the right things, and there's a belief in the process. To your point, maybe it pays dividends later in the year as the young group continues to gel, or maybe it's next year that we're able to realize a little bit of value when their schedule sets up more favorably.
Yeah, the kid to keep an eye on, the defense, that defensive end, that Kamara kid can really get after the pass, the quarterback. I will say this is another time where I saw some value, Colorado State. Maybe this is why you're betting them individually, because of that whole thing. They get crushed by FCS Sacramento State. And what happens after that? Market throws them in the trash. They cover 6 of their last 8 games. You'll see that, me saying that from time to time throughout these previews.
And honestly, look, I mean, we joke about it all the time. The best thing for some of these teams to continue to fly under the radar is when they're not winning games, but they're covering numbers. There's a lot to be said when you're a massive underdog, but you have a defense that's out there fighting. Look, when you're a 20-point pup, I don't expect you to go out there and win games, but if you're losing by 10 to 13 and I can get a rocking chair cover, continue to stay under the radar, identify a little bit of the value, and that's the one good thing that you see in college sports more than the NFL, the NBA, and some of those other spots, although I feel like it was the Detroit Pistons or one team this year that covered a ridiculous amount of games but never really won. I mean, these are the things you look for. And honestly, you know, we can study spreadsheets. We can look at the stats, the advanced metrics. That's one thing where I will never say that you can't watch the games. You'll be able to learn as much about those teams and just the way they're fighting and the way those games are going based on body language and everything else. And to Colorado State's credit, despite being a dreadful football team, they were out there fighting until the bitter end. So we'll see exactly what the Rams bring to the table. When we look at the bottom of the Mountain West, I mean, we've done a deep dive on just about every college football team so far through the group of 5. There are obviously dregs that we spent less time on than others. Brad, I'm not sure I want to necessarily allocate an extended amount of time to this trio of teams, and it's no disrespect meant to their prominent fan bases or players that are out there working. But when we look at New Mexico, we look at Nevada, and we look at Hawaii, all of these teams right around that 100-1 range thereabouts. Nevada a shade shorter there. But of these 3 teams, if you had a couple little nuggets or tidbits, things that we could watch for teams that I believe you said at the top, all power rate in your bottom 5.
So we'll save New Mexico for last. Hint, hint, wink, wink on that one as far as value. So I'll save them for last. I'll go Nevada. I'm actually more optimistic on what they at least had last year, where they entered this season on a 10-game losing streak. But I liked what they did. They went out and got a bunch of transfers, mostly from the Power 5. Wilson, their head coach, really leaned on his past experience in the Pac-12. Got a bunch of kids from Cal and Oregon, and they flash, and they're going to start. I mean, I would say half their starting 22 is going to be Power 5 transfers. So I upgraded Nevada significantly. But kid to look out for if you're just looking for players. Drew Watts, a linebacker. I think he's first team All Mountain West capable there. It'll be interesting to see how good the quarterback play is. Lewis, Colorado transfer, looks to be the starter. So I'm not wild about that, but man, Nevada was one of my biggest win total positions early. Man, DraftKings opened 2.5. That was one I didn't get. Somebody else beat me to that punch.
You're losing a step over there. Are you getting old, Brad, that somebody's beating you to an opening number? What the hell's going on around here?
I had to gather the team. We can't bet on apps. We got to hit the kiosk, and they didn't get those kiosks fast enough. So I was very happy to bet over 3. If you find a rogue 3.5 out there, I still think that's good. So I am buying Nevada. Hawaii, I'm indifferent. Haven't bet their win total yet. One thing I do want to mention, I'll be the only podcast to talk about this player, but I went down a rabbit hole last night on just one player that they're incoming, Eddie Osai Nikitia. He is known as the fastest man in the South Pacific. He runs 100 meters. He's got the record holder for the country of New Zealand. He's run it at 10:08. So we'll put that in perspective, 100 meters. That's faster than Tyreek Hill in the NFL. He's 6'5", 210. I mean, he's built,
That's a big dude running that kind of speed.
Yeah, so we've always wondered, what would Usain Bolt, a little bit bigger, a little thicker, what would he be like on the football field? We might see it with this kid. Keep an eye on him. Now, he's never played football before, but he's 22 years old. He looks 35. He is a grown man that's as fast as anybody in the world, and that could be a secret weapon for Hawaii. That's really down the weeds, but keep an eye.
Does he have a rugby background, Brad, or how did they end up going about recruiting a player like that from New Zealand at 22 to play college football?
He kind of recruited himself. He's a football fan. His dream is to play in the NFL. So what happened was New Zealand bungled his Olympic dreams or something like that. They didn't get him credit for some record and some other stuff. I don't know what happened there. He felt a little, I really went down a rabbit hole on this kid. He felt a little bit shaded, and somehow one of the Hawaii assistant coaches was already recruiting the Samoans, the Polynesian Islands, and whatnot, and happened to know about this kid. So He's going to play for Hawaii. He might be a sleeping superstar there on the islands.
Hey, I mean, Todd in his early 20s, from a nostalgia standpoint, wants nothing more than Timmy Chang to resurrect the Hawaii program and turn them into the run-and-gun fun show that we used to see late at nights when you could barely get their games, and your game tracker wasn't really all that accurate either, because you'd go through stretches where there wasn't a play updated, and then suddenly you'd have 3 drives that automatically updated to ESPN. So figuring out exactly what was going on with the full run and shoot was a different day and age with Jerry Glanville, June Jones, and everything else that they had going on with that particular program. Are you optimistic, by the way, not to go on a tangent there, when I look at Hawaii, that this program can get rebuilt into something competitive, or do we feel like this is a program destined to really struggle and bowl eligibility is kind of the best thing that they can hope for in this current day and age?
Yeah, I think those days, the June Jones days, aren't happening anytime soon. I think you would even hope just to get back to where they were just a few years ago, where bowl games were pretty much the norm. Todd Graham really ruined that program. It doesn't take much to really burn it down, and it doesn't help that you really don't have the stadium situations. I mean, they're playing in a high school facility for the most part, and that's going to be the case for the next 4 or 5 years. So I think Timmy Chang's the right guy for the job. And look, what you're looking for is a team not giving up, and they looked abysmal. Looked like the worst team in the country at the start of last season. But, man, they fight, clawed, and scratch. And if you're betting Hawaii, and I know the people on the island love betting, they really do. Hawaii covered 7 of their last 8 games. So maybe it's not a team that's going to make a run towards a conference championship, but it might be a team that we can make some money on.
Yeah, to your point, I mean, watch them a couple times late in the year, and while they weren't the most talented or skilled, the team that had gone through as much adversity as they have would have been easy to curl up and die. They were out there fighting every single snap, and for a lot of other teams that had cashed in their chips, they were able to take advantage and fly under the radar from an ATS perspective. So it'll be interesting to monitor Hawaii and what that program becomes. You mentioned their stadium. It looks like Aloha Stadium's capacity going to be reduced from 50,000 to 25,000, and they're saying the target completion date now 2028. They're trying to build a retail district around it. It feels like an absolute abject disaster. So we'll see exactly what the native son and Timmy Chang is able to do and keep some of that local talent, one of the more underrated high school contingents out there, if he can keep them at home instead of sending them to the mainland. You can follow Brad on Twitter. I should have done this earlier, but I figure all of you loyal Bet the Board listeners already know this, at Brad Powers 7. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. And again, follow the podcast at Bet the Board. You can also follow Payne, who will jump into the fold in a couple short weeks when we get into some of the Power 5 leagues, and he gets to talk about his beloved Florida State Seminoles at Payne Insider. But Brad, you did what we call in this business a tease. You said you didn't want to break down the New Mexico Lobos when we went through a lot of the teams individually. I'm guessing this is where you're going to train your focus during the best bet portion of the program.
Yeah, we're going to go under 4 wins here. And 4 is available at DraftKings, Willie Hill, Caesars, Bet Online. Best price, again, we're going to have to lay a little bit of juice here, minus 150. So shop around for the best price. But we can get under 4. I have bet under 4 is what I bet, a little bit less juice than that. And here's what I'm seeing. First, it's a New Mexico program that's really struggled. I mean, the Rocky Long days are way behind in the rearview mirror at this point. I mean, they're 15-52 since 2017. This is a team that the market just cannot grasp as far as how to downgrade this program. I mean, they've only covered 4 games the last 2 years. You would think, value for this year. I don't know. I don't see the value when you're consistently the worst offense in the country. Dylan Hopkins and the new offense coordinator from UAB, Brian Vincent, sure, they'll be better, but that's not saying much. What really worries me here is, even despite the fact they've been terrible, from not only an ATS perspective and a win-loss perspective the last couple of years, the one thing they could hang their hat on was they still could put forth a solid defense. I question that ability this year. Rocky Long left. I mean, Danny Gonzalez, the head coach, is supposed to be his protege, and Rocky Long's 70-some years old. Why would he not want to just, be a DC at New Mexico until he retires? He left to go to be DC at Syracuse, so surprised by that. The top 7 tacklers are gone. One of their best players transferred out after spring. So top 7 guys are gone. You're thinking, well, they weren't that great to begin with. But I'm telling you, 5 of those 7 guys are probably all league caliber. So all those guys gone on the defensive side of the ball. Then I look at schedule. I mean, I got them at least a touchdown underdog in 8 games. They're favored only in one game. They got 3 toss-up games. So basically, this team's got to win the game they're favored in, win all 3 toss-up games just for this win total to push. I'm going under 4.
So you're telling me the stretch from week 2 to week 4 will pretty much determine their season against Tennessee Tech, New Mexico State, and a nice little road trip, because I'm sure it's a flight that a lot of us have taken in the past from Albuquerque to Amherst when they go to take on UMass. So imagine that'll be the stretch that can define Lobos football under Danny Gonzalez. Man, I wonder, Brad, do we feel like this is, if he ends up at 2-10 this season, it'll be Gonzalez's final year? I just don't know what you can even expect down there in Albuquerque to try and rebuild this football program into what it was during Rocky Long's heyday, because obviously Bob Davie basically burned it to the ground. Not quite the same way that Todd Graham did in Hawaii, but it feels like there's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, you don't have a recruiting base. I thought, I promise this isn't political, but just the way that the COVID policies were run in that state probably had more of a negative impact on New Mexico than any other program in the country. Keep in mind that 2020 season, they were playing games here in Vegas. They were living out of a hotel here because they couldn't practice due to the COVID policies there. And those COVID policies carried over into 2021. So Danny Gonzalez picked a bad time to pick up this job. Those first 2 years were a nightmare, and he just hasn't been able to recover since.
Yeah, it's tough. Look, you're going to displace an entire student body for a variety of those rules and, take them out of their comfort zone. It takes a very strong leader. We talked a little bit about Tulane doing that and what their disjointed season meant when they got displaced by a hurricane for very different reasons. They were able to bounce back, but Willie Fritz and Danny Gonzalez not quite mentioned in the same breath as far as their coaching acumen. And to your point, recruiting in the state of New Mexico, you're not exactly working with a very deep base. So unless you can pull from Texas and some of the surrounding states, always going to be a little bit of an uphill battle. All right, Mr. Brad, that is, by my count, 4 Group of 5 previews in the bank. We're nearly through about 50 teams so far, and that means just slightly more than 80 teams left to go before we get to week 0 and week 1. Before we head into the weekend, any things you'd like to share in terms of any of the other leagues that we've already touched on? Any nuggets you've uncovered since, or have we done enough damage for one Friday that we can bid our listeners a fond farewell as they listen to San Jose State and New Mexico breakdowns when they sit on the beach sipping those frosty beverages?
No, we did an hour and 11 minutes. That's enough on this. But I will say this, little preview for Sunbelt. We've been a lot of negativity in these Group of 5s as far as the trend line from a power ratings perspective. The Sunbelt is the one G5 conference where it's opposite. The trend line's been up for those teams.
Hey, let me tell you about the Sun Belt, not to go on a tangent or play spoiler. Last year, watching a lot of those teams on a week-in, week-out basis was a ton of fun. You had teams that were out there and borderline Power 5 caliber defenses and some offensive skill position players.
Yep.
I talked about the guilty pleasure of watching Colorado State. I felt the same way about Troy, but I didn't feel nearly as dirty when I watched Troy football week-in, week-out as I did watching Colorado State.
No, that was a fun defense to watch.
So on that note, we will be back with all of you guys and girls next week. A little bit of Sunbelt talk. If you haven't already done so, encourage you guys to do it now. Go back and listen to some of the other Group of 5 previews, the American Athletic, Conference USA, the MAC, you name it. It's all there in all of its glory. There's nobody better to break all those teams down for you. And like we say around these parts, we do the work so you guys don't have to. Most importantly, though, Mr. Brad, with a New Mexico win total ticket under the total in hand, hopefully we'll see all of our loyal listeners at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.